Hello, it's good to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story. The Montana sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of blue, stretched tight over the jagged teeth of the Beartooth Mountains. Down below, nestled in a valley carved by time and meltwater, lay the Stoneheart Ranch. It was a fitting name, Walter often thought, for a place that demanded everything from a man and offered little comfort in return. The land was his life, his legacy, and his warden, a sprawling kingdom of rock and grass that had claimed his wife years ago and had held him prisoner ever since. Walter, a man of 40 years with shoulders as broad as a barn door and hands calloused from a lifetime of labor, stood on his porch. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, scanned the property. The fences were strong, the cattle were healthy, and the barn stood defiant against the wind. But when his gaze turned back to the ranch house, a familiar scowl settled on his face. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams slanting through the grimy windows. A plate from last night's solitary meal, a slab of salted beef and cold beans, still sat on the table. The place stank of loneliness and neglect. He was a rancher, not a housekeeper. The endless cycle of mending, branding, and driving cattle left him too exhausted to concern himself with sweeping floors or baking bread. He'd tried hiring local women, but none lasted. They were either too flighty, too talkative, or too quick to cast pitying glances his way, their soft words a grating reminder of the wife he'd lost and the silence that had followed. He didn't need pity. He needed efficiency. He needed order. It was this single-minded pursuit of order that had led him to the town of Red Lodge and to the somber home of the Abernathy family. Harvey Abernathy, a man broken by bad luck and worse decisions, owed a considerable debt to the bank, a debt Walter had overheard being discussed in the mercantile. An idea, cold and practical, had formed in Walter's mind. He had money. Abernathy had a daughter. A transaction could be made that would solve both their problems. He'd laid out the terms with the bluntness of a hammer striking an anvil. He would clear the Abernathy debt in its entirety. In exchange, their daughter Alma would come to his ranch as his live-in housekeeper. A 5-year contract, room and board provided, no wages, as the payment was the cleared debt itself. It was a steep price, but desperation was a powerful motivator. He watched as the parents looked at their daughter, their shame a palpable thing in the cramped, dim parlor. And he watched Alma, a slip of a girl in her early 20s, with hair the color of dried wheat and eyes that held a sorrow far older than her years. She had met his gaze directly, a flicker of defiance in their depths, before lowering her head and agreeing in a voice barely above a whisper. She was being sold, and they all knew it. But for Walter, it wasn't personal. It was a solution, a resource acquired to ensure the smooth operation of his ranch. Now, a week later, the buckboard he'd sent for her was rattling up the long, winding dirt road to the house. Walter remained on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, a statue of impassive authority. He watched as the driver helped her down. She carried a single, small carpet bag that seemed to hold all her worldly possessions. Her dress was a simple, well-worn grey calico, its fabric loose and flowing, doing little to flatter her slender frame. Alma stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her head bowed. She did not look at him but at the weathered planks beneath his boots. The silence stretched, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow and the sigh of the wind through the pines. "The rules are simple," Walter said finally, his voice a low rumble that carried no warmth. "The house is your domain. I expect it clean. I expect meals on time, breakfast at sunrise, dinner at sunset. I am not a man for idle chatter. You do your work, you keep to yourself, and we will have no problems." "Yes, sir," she murmured to the wood. "Your room is at the back next to the kitchen. It's small, but it's clean." He gestured vaguely with his chin. "The well is out back. Firewood is stacked by the side door. I trust you know your duties." "I do, sir." He waited, expecting more, perhaps tears, or a plea, or a flash of the defiance he'd seen in her eyes before. He got nothing but a quiet, unnerving stillness. It was as if she had erected a wall around herself, a fortress of resignation that he could not penetrate. It was unsettling. He preferred things he could understand, things he could control. A spooked horse, a stubborn bull, a coming storm, those he could handle. This quiet, sorrowful woman was an unknown quantity. He grunted and stepped aside, allowing her passage into the house she would now manage, the house that was now her cage. She moved past him without a sound, a ghost in grey, and disappeared into the dim interior. For the rest of the day, Walter went about his chores, the rhythm of the work a familiar comfort. He repaired a section of fence line, reshoed his mare, and hauled feed to the troughs. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the house, to the silent figure within. He found himself listening for sounds, the clatter of a pot, the swish of a broom. But she moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost eerie. When he came in for dinner as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, the change was immediate and startling. The grime was gone from the windows. The floors were swept clean of dust and mud. The table was set for one, a clean plate and polished silverware gleaming in the lamplight. A stew rich with beef and vegetables simmered on the stove, its aroma filling the room with a warmth that had been absent for years. Alma stood by the hearth, her back to him, her hands clasped behind her. She did not turn as he entered. "Dinner is ready, sir," she said. He sat down, and she served him, moving with a grace that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn home. They did not speak during the meal. Walter ate, his focus on the food, refusing to acknowledge the profound comfort of a hot meal he hadn't cooked himself over a fire pit. When he was finished, she cleared his plate without a word. This became their routine. Days bled into weeks, marked by silent sunrises and quiet sunsets. The Stoneheart Ranch had never run more smoothly. The house was spotless, his clothes were mended, and there was always a hot meal waiting. Alma was the perfect housekeeper, invisible, efficient, and utterly silent. Yet Walter found himself watching her. He noticed things. He noticed the way the light caught in her pale hair when she bent over the vegetable garden she had started near the kitchen. He noticed the small calloused hands that were surprisingly gentle as she kneaded dough, and he began to notice something else, something that pricked at the edges of his consciousness. It was in the way she moved, a certain carefulness to her steps. It was in the dresses she wore, always loose, always concealing her form, and it was in a small unconscious gesture he witnessed one afternoon through the kitchen window. She was standing by the stove, waiting for a pot to boil, and for a fleeting moment, as she stared out at the unforgiving mountains, she thought herself unobserved. Her right hand came up to rest on her lower belly, a gesture of such profound and instinctive protection that it sent a jolt through him. It was a gesture of a secret being kept, of a life being guarded. The moment passed as quickly as it came. She dropped her hand and turned back to her work. But the image was seared into Walter's mind. He had made a bargain for a housekeeper, a simple, straightforward transaction. But as he stood there, the cold, practical certainty he lived by began to crack, and a sliver of suspicion, dark and unwelcome, began to take root in the stony soil of his heart. The brutal summer heat bled slowly from the land, replaced by the crisp, golden light of a Montana autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, defiant yellow, and a chill settled into the nights, whispering of the snows to come. Inside the ranch house, an even more profound transformation had taken place. The seasons of dust and neglect had given way to an era of quiet order. The scent of pine cleaner and beeswax now hung in the air, mingling with the daily aroma of baking bread or simmering stew. Walter found the change affecting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. With the burden of domestic chores lifted, his mind was clearer, more focused on the ranch. He worked with a renewed efficiency, his days measured not by the growl in his stomach, but by the steady, predictable rhythm of the meals Alma provided. He began to look forward to returning to the house at dusk, not for conversation, for there was still none, but for the simple, profound comfort of walking into a clean, warm space. The silence was different now. It was no longer the hollow echo of absence, but a shared, peaceful quiet. He had purchased a housekeeper, a pair of hands to perform a function, but as the weeks turned into months, he found it impossible to see Alma as merely a part of the transaction. He saw her strength. He saw it in the way she hauled buckets of water from the well without complaint, her back straight and her steps measured. He saw it in the tireless motion of her hands as she scrubbed, mended, and cooked, turning his stark bachelor's quarters into a semblance of a home. He saw a dignity in her that humbled him, a quiet resilience that shone from her sorrowful eyes. He found himself admiring her, a feeling as foreign and unwelcome as a guest at his solitary table. But with this grudging admiration came a growing, gnawing suspicion. Other small details he had noticed upon her arrival now began to form a disturbing pattern. One morning, rising before the sun to check on a mare about to foal, he heard it clearly from the back of the house, the unmistakable, wretched sound of someone being violently ill. He'd paused, his hand on the barn door, listening until the sound subsided, a cold knot tightening in his gut. A few days later, It happened again. He told himself it could be a bad bit of meat, a flux in the stomach, anything. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him that it was not. His observations grew more focused, more intense. He watched her as she hung his laundered shirts on the line, the autumn wind whipping the grey fabric of her dress against her body. For a single damning moment, the loose cloth was pulled taut, revealing the undeniable truth of her shape. It was no longer the slender frame of the girl who had arrived weeks ago. There was a gentle but distinct roundness to her middle that could not be attributed to his regular meals. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a sprung bear trap. The loose dresses, the careful, almost protective way she moved, the morning sickness, the hand that instinctively sought her belly when she thought she was alone. A cold fury, sharp and bitter, began to course through Walter's veins. He had been deceived, swindled. He had paid a family's debt in good faith, purchasing 5 years of labor. Instead, he'd been saddled with a disgraced woman and whatever trouble she was carrying. He felt like a fool, his pragmatism and shrewd judgment turned into a mockery. The confrontation he was rehearsing in his mind was postponed by the arrival of a lone rider. It was Wicasa, a respected elder from the Crow village situated on the other side of the ridge. Wicasa was a man who looked as if he'd been carved from the ancient rock of the mountains themselves, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding the patient wisdom of one who understands the language of the seasons and the sky. He and Walter had a long-standing arrangement of trade and mutual distant respect. "Walter," Wicasa said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves, dismounting from his pinto pony. He carried a bundle of expertly cured beaver pelts. "Wicasa," Walter nodded, his own voice tight. "The air grows teeth." "It does," the old man agreed, his eyes scanning the ranch. "The land prepares for its long sleep." They conducted their business on the porch, as they always did. Walter brought out a sack of flour and another of salt, and they traded, the exchange sealed with a simple nod. As Wicasa was tying the sacks to his saddle, the ranch house door opened, and Alma stepped out to shake a rug. She saw the visitor and froze for a moment, her eyes wide before offering a shy, hesitant nod and retreating back inside. Wicasa's gaze followed her, and he was silent for a long moment. His sharp, knowing eyes, which missed nothing, had taken in her form in that brief instant. He turned back to Walter, and a faint, unreadable expression crossed his face. "The soil of the Stoneheart is more fertile than it has been in many years," Wicasa observed, his words chosen as carefully as stones for a river crossing. He looked from Walter's hard face toward the closed door of the house. "The spring brings new life to the plains, even after the harshest winter. It is the way of things." He swung himself onto his pony with an agility that belied his age. Without another word, he turned the horse and rode away, his figure shrinking against the vast backdrop of the mountains. Walter stood frozen on the porch, Wicasa's words echoing in his ears. New life. The old man had seen it. He had seen the truth in a single glance, and had laid it bare with his simple, profound words. The last shred of doubt evaporated, replaced by a white-hot certainty. He had been played for a fool, his generosity and his home used as a shelter for another man's shame. He turned and stormed into the house, his heavy boots thudding against the newly polished floorboards. He found Alma in the kitchen, her back to him, kneading dough on a floured countertop. The domestic scene, which moments ago might have brought him a sliver of peace, now filled him with rage. All of it, the clean floors, the fresh bread, the quiet order, felt like a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide her deceit. She must have sensed his presence, the sheer force of his anger, because she stopped her work, her hands stilling in the soft dough. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and weary resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived. He strode across the room, closing the distance between them, until he loomed over her, trapping her against the counter. He lowered his face close to hers, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the quiet kitchen like a razor. "I made a bargain for a housekeeper," he seethed, his eyes boring into hers. "Not for another man's problem. You will tell me the truth, right now." He gestured sharply toward her stomach with his chin. "What secret are you hiding under that dress, woman? Folks, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Write your city and state here in the comments so I can send a shout-out." The silence in the kitchen was as thick as mud, broken only by the frantic pounding of Alma's heart in her own ears. Walter's accusation hung between them, a tangible thing, heavy and sharp. For months she had lived on a knife's edge, praying this moment would never come. knowing with a dreadful certainty that it would. Now that it was here, the strength that had held her together for so long finally crumbled. Her carefully constructed fortress of resignation dissolved into dust. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the flour, dusting her cheek. Then another. She did not sob or make a sound, but the silent tears spoke of a grief so profound it needed no voice. "He promised me marriage," she whispered, her voice cracking. Her gaze fell to her hands, still resting in the lifeless dough. "His name was Samuel. He was a clerk in my father's town. He spoke of a future, a small house with a garden. He filled my head with promises." She took a shaky breath, the shame of it all washing over her anew. "When I told him about the child, the promises vanished. He was gone the next day, vanished like a ghost, leaving me to face the disgrace alone." She finally lifted her eyes to meet Walter's, and for the first time, he saw past the quiet housekeeper to the terrified young woman beneath. "My family was ruined by the debt. When you made your offer, it was a lifeline, Mr. Stone. A chance for my baby to be born with a roof over its head. I never meant to deceive you, I only meant to survive." Her confession did little to extinguish the fire of his anger. If anything, it stoked it. It was no longer a simple deception. It was a tangled mess of another man's irresponsibility and her desperation, all of it now dumped squarely on his land, in his house. His pride was a raw, festering wound. The whole county would laugh at him. Walter Stone, the shrewd rancher, played for a fool by a slip of a girl and the ghost of some sweet-talking clerk. "Survive?" he snarled, the word tasting like poison. "You brought another man's shame into my home and called it survival. You have used me." He backed away from her, his movements stiff with fury, and pointed a damning finger toward the door. "I want you gone. By sunrise, I want you and your problem off my land." He didn't wait for her response. He turned on his heel, grabbed his hat and coat from the peg by the door, and stormed out, slamming it so hard the windows rattled in their frames. The cold night air was a shock to his system, but it did little to cool the rage burning within him. He strode to the corral, saddled his mare with rough, angry movements, and swung himself up. He needed to move. He needed the wind and the wilderness to scour this feeling from his soul. He rode hard, urging the horse up into the rocky hills that overlooked the valley. He didn't have a destination. He was just running from the suffocating confines of the house and the woman inside it. The moon was a cold silver disk in the inky sky, illuminating a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as his own heart. This was his world, a world of clear lines and brutal truths. An animal was either useful or it wasn't. Land was either fertile or barren. A deal was either honored or broken. She had broken the deal. He reined the horse in at the crest of a ridge, its sides heaving, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Below him, the Stoneheart Ranch was a single point of faint yellow light in a vast sea of darkness. His kingdom, a kingdom he had built with his own 2 hands, a legacy without an heir. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had no son. His wife Sarah had been taken by a fever before they could have children, leaving him with nothing but the silence and the land. He had poured all of his life, his sweat, his grief, into this ranch. For what? For whom? He thought of Alma, alone in that house. A woman, pregnant and disgraced, being cast out into the world as winter approached. He knew what her fate would be. At best, she'd find work in a brothel in some rough mining town. At worst, he didn't want to contemplate the worst. His code, the unwritten, unspoken set of rules he lived by, warred with his wounded pride. He could not be the man who sent a pregnant woman to her doom. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with anger. And what of the child? It was innocent in all this. Another man's blood, yes, but it would be born under his roof. A child on the Stoneheart Ranch. A small, irrational part of his mind latched onto the idea. A child's laughter echoing in the silent house. A small hand to one day teach how to mend a fence, how to read the sky for rain. A solution began to form in his mind, as cold and practical as the moonlight on the rocks around him. It was insane. It was illogical. And yet, it was the only path he could see that satisfied both his honor and his need for order. It was a business proposition, nothing more. A way to solve all their problems in one clean, decisive stroke. He turned the mare around and rode back down the hill, the gallop replaced by a slow, deliberate walk. His anger had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold ashes of resolve. When he entered the house, the fire had been banked, and the lamps were turned down low. A single carpet bag, the one she had arrived with, sat by the door. Alma stood near the hearth, wearing her coat and bonnet, her face pale, but her expression calm. She was ready. She hadn't waited for morning. She had been prepared to walk out into the cold, dark night. Her quiet dignity struck him silent for a moment. She met his gaze, not with fear, but with a weary acceptance. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice rough. He nodded toward her bag. "Unpack your things." She stared at him, confused. "But you said—" "I know what I said," he interrupted, walking to the center of the room. He took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it over and over. "I have a proposal for you. It is not born of affection, so do not mistake it for such. It is a solution." He looked at her, his face a mask of grim practicality. "The child you carry needs a name, a father. My ranch needs an heir. I will give the child my name. We will be married. To the world, the child will be mine, born early. No one will question it. You will continue your duties as mistress of this house, and in return, your child will be legitimate. They will inherit this land. It is a contract, Miss Abernathy. Nothing more." Alma looked at him as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue. She blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend the cold, unbelievable offer. A marriage of convenience. A loveless, practical arrangement to save her from ruin and provide him with an heir. He was not offering her salvation out of kindness. He was offering a transaction to protect his reputation and secure his legacy. It was a cage, but it was a safe one. It was a life devoid of love, but it was a life. For her child, it was everything. Slowly, as the full weight of his proposal settled upon her, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," she whispered into the silent room. "Yes, Mr. Stone, I accept your terms." The wedding was as stark and unadorned as the Montana winter landscape. It took place in the town magistrate's dusty office, the only witnesses a clerk with a bored expression and the wind rattling the window pane. Walter stood straight and solemn in his best coat, his face set like granite. Alma, in a simple blue dress she had mended herself, stood beside him, a pale and silent bride. They spoke the required words, their voices flat and devoid of emotion. He placed a plain gold band on her finger, his late wife's ring, which he'd retrieved from a locked wooden box that morning. It was a cold, heavy circle of metal, a symbol not of love, but of a binding contract. They rode back to the Stoneheart Ranch as Mr. and Mrs. Stone, the new title a strange and ill-fitting garment for them both. The barrier of master and servant was gone, but in its place stood a wall of awkward formality that was even higher and colder. He called her Alma, no longer woman, but the name felt foreign on his tongue. She called him Walter, her voice barely a whisper, the "sir" she was accustomed to catching in her throat. Life settled into a new, strange rhythm. She was no longer just his housekeeper, she was the mistress of his home, but she still cooked his meals, mended his clothes, and kept the house with the same quiet efficiency as before. He was no longer just her employer, he was her husband, the man who had given her and her unborn child his name. The dynamic was a constant, unspoken negotiation of boundaries. He found himself hesitating at the door of his own bedroom, which was now hers as well, though he continued to sleep in the small cot in his office, affording her the privacy of the main bed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ice began to thaw. The change started not with words, but with actions. Walter would come in from the cold and find a hot cup of coffee waiting on the table, a small, unspoken kindness. He in turn began to notice the strain the late stages of her pregnancy were putting on her. He took the heavier tasks from her, hauling the water buckets himself and stacking the firewood closer to the door. One evening, he returned from a trip to town and placed a small, cloth-bound book of poetry on her bedside table without a word. He'd seen her looking at the books on his shelf with a wistful expression and had acted on an impulse he didn't fully understand. He began to watch her differently. He saw the way she would sit by the fire in the evenings, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, a look of serene, maternal love on her face. A fierce, protective instinct began to grow in him, an instinct that had nothing to do with contracts or heirs. This was his wife, this was his child. The lie they had agreed upon was, in his own heart, slowly becoming a truth. One night, unable to sleep, he walked silently into the main room. Alma was asleep in the large bed, her breathing soft and even. In the flickering firelight he saw her, vulnerable and beautiful. Drawn by an unseen force, he knelt by the bed. Hesitantly, he reached out a calloused hand and laid it gently on her belly. He felt a distinct kick, a flutter of the new life within. A raw, unfamiliar emotion swelled in his chest. "You be good to your mother, little one," he whispered. his voice thick. "She's a strong woman. You be strong like her." He thought she was asleep, but as he spoke, he saw a single tear slide from beneath her closed eyelid. She had heard him. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, more powerful than any vow they had spoken. Weeks later, the sky turned a menacing shade of grey. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a mournful howl. Walter, checking the livestock, recognized the signs immediately. A blizzard, and a bad one. He worked frantically, securing the animals in the barn and reinforcing the shutters on the house. By midday, the world outside had disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. Snow piled in massive drifts against the doors and windows, sealing them inside. The Stoneheart Ranch was an isolated island in a frozen, raging sea. They were trapped. The fire roared in the hearth, a bastion of warmth against the storm's fury. Walter was checking the last of the shutters when he heard a sharp gasp from behind him. He turned to see Alma clutching the back of a chair, her face pale, her knuckles white. "Walter," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and fear. "The babies, it's coming." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. The nearest doctor was in Red Lodge, a lifetime away through this storm. There were no neighbors, no help. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. He saw the fear in her eyes mirror his own. But then he looked at her trust, at her desperate need, and the panic was consumed by a wave of ferocious determination. He was a rancher. He had helped birth dozens of calves and foals in difficult conditions. He would not fail her. "All right," he said, his voice calmer and steadier than he felt. "All right, Alma, we can do this." The hours that followed were a blur of primal, focused intensity. The world shrank to the small firelit room, the sound of the howling blizzard a distant counterpoint to Alma's ragged breaths. Walter moved with a purpose he didn't know he possessed. He boiled water, gathered clean linens, and spoke to her in a low, steady murmur, his words a lifeline in her sea of pain. He coached her, held her hand, wiped the sweat from her brow. All the awkwardness, all the pretense of their arrangement was stripped away, burned to ash in the crucible of that room. There was no master and servant, no husband and wife of convenience. There were only two people, a man and a woman, working together to bring a new life into the world. In the deepest, darkest hour of the night, as the storm raged its hardest, a new sound joined the chorus. It was a thin, reedy wail, a cry of life that cut through the wind's roar and filled the silent spaces of the house. It was a girl. Walter, his hands shaking, carefully cleaned the infant and wrapped her snugly in a clean flannel blanket. He looked at her tiny, perfect face, the small mouth working silently, and a love so vast and overwhelming struck him that it brought him to his knees. This was not another man's child. This was his daughter. He brought the baby to Alma, who lay exhausted but radiant against the pillows. She reached out her arms, and he gently placed the small bundle in them. As Alma looked down at her daughter, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy lit up her face, chasing away the last shadows of her sorrow. Walter sat on the edge of the bed, watching them. He looked at this woman, his wife, who had shown him the meaning of strength and resilience. He looked at this child, his daughter, who had been born in the heart of a storm and had brought with her an impossible peace. He realized then that the contract, the bargain, the debt, none of it mattered. It had all just been the rugged, winding path that had led him here, to this moment. He hadn't bought a housekeeper to solve a problem. He had stumbled blindly into the family his lonely heart had yearned for. The blizzard raged on outside, but inside the small ranch house the storm had passed. Reaching out, Walter gently took Alma's free hand in his own. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in their depths he saw not gratitude, but love. "Walter," she whispered. He squeezed her hand, his heart too full for words. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm golden glow on the three of them, a father, a mother, and a child, a family, born not of a contract, but of a secret, a storm, and a love as wild and resilient as the Montana land itself. True family isn't always born of blood or promises, but can be forged in the most unexpected circumstances, growing from a foundation of necessity into a structure of genuine love and acceptance. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.